All right, hi everyone. So in this next section, I'm going to be talking about how international trade shapes the economy, and we're going to be using supply and demand to assess the consequences of international trade. So again, a few definitions. So the world supply is the total quantity supplied by all sellers around the world for a good. So if we're looking at t-shirts, the world supply of t-shirts is going to be the sum of all producers of t-shirt. That would be the world supply. And same thing for demand. That's going to be the total quantity demanded by all buyers around the world. So world demand of t-shirts is going to be the total sum of the demand for t-shirts by everyone around the world. And the equilibrium is going to be where world supply meets world demand. And the world price is going to be the price where a good or service is bought by the world markets. So here is the supply and demand model for the world supply and world demand. So this is what it looks like with the definitions there. And now we're going to look at how imports shape the domestic market. So for shirts. So in this case, we're going to be looking at shirts. So here is a graph that just shows the domestic demand and domestic supply of t-shirts, but without any trade at all. So this is just domestically, and this is the equilibrium here with the price of a shirt being $20 and the supply being 100 million shirts. All right, next slide. So we're going to be looking at how imports shape the domestic market for shirts. So step one, we saw before that if you look back here, we have the world price for shirts here at $12. And this is the equilibrium for the international world supply and international world demand. So if we go back, one is that we're going to have the new world price for t-shirts. So that's going to be here, this straight line at $12. So the price of imported goods declines to the world price. So now instead of these domestic consumers having to buy shirts at $20, they'll be able to enjoy shirts at $12 thanks to these new imports. In the next step, we're going to be looking at how at this new price, we'll see how the domestic supply curve, we'll check the domestic supply curve to find the quantity supplied by the domestic sellers and the quantity demanded by the domestic consumers. And so if you look here, this is the domestic supply curve. If you look here at the blue line, this is domestic demand curve. With this new world price now at $12, the new quantity supplied by the domestic suppliers is going to be where the domestic supply curve meets the international world price. So now at $12, we're going to be domestic suppliers are only going to be producing 40 million instead of the 100 million they were originally producing at this equilibrium when there was no trade and no imports. And now if you follow this straight line at $12, the world price line, you'll see that it's going to intersect this domestic demand curve at this point. And this 140 million t-shirts is going to be the quantity demanded by domestic buyers at this price. So now that the price is at $12, people are going to demand a lot more. They're going to demand more than they demanded when it was at 20. So you're going to see here, this is a new demand. And if you go to the next slide, now imports make up the difference between domestic demand and domestic supply. So if you look here, domestic supply is only 40 million because at a lower price, there's going to be less supply. And at a lower price, there's going to be more demand. So now instead of it being at the domestic equilibrium like it was before, you're going to see this big gap between these two intersections at the world price. And this intersection is going to represent, or this difference here is going to represent the amount imported into the country. So the imports here, we're at 140 million t-shirts demanded by domestic buyers and only 40 million shirts being produced by domestic sellers. So we're going to have this import of 100 million t-shirts. So that's how it works. You could look at these models that just represent the different stages of this, but that's how the international market works when you import a good into a country that's below their domestic price. So consequences of imports. When buyers import goods, the price declines to the world price like we saw. The lower price reduces the quantity supplied by the domestic sellers and increases the quantity demanded by domestic buyers. And imports fill the gap between the supply and demand. That's all the different steps that we just saw. American consumers gain when they import a good because they pay a lower price, and American producers lose because they must lower the price that they charge for their good, or they'll lose their consumers. So policy question, do the gains outweigh the costs? We're going to see that. So figure 4 here is the welfare consequences of allowing imports. So if you looked here, this is the original supply and demand curve of the domestic economy before trade. So if you look here, the consumer surplus is going to be this triangle A. That's what the consumers gain or enjoy when purchasing the t-shirts at that price of $20, which is here. And the triangle B and C is the producer surplus, what they enjoyed when there was no imports. And the whole triangle here, this entire triangle represents the total surplus enjoyed in this economy. So this little model shows that as well. But now, if you allow imports, you remember that at the world price, the price is lower than the original domestic price. So now all these consumers right here that originally couldn't enjoy the good because it was too expensive for them, that it was above their price. Oops. This is the domestic price here. Now with the lower world price, all these consumers are now able to enjoy the good. So now you can see that with free trade, the domestic surplus, the consumer surplus, increases by a lot. It increases by this amount D. So now the new consumer surplus is, if you look here, it's this big triangle here. But then if you look on the other side, the producer surplus did drop, where it was originally this big triangle up here. And now it's just this smaller triangle here. And yeah, now if you look at the difference, this was the total increase in surplus, this triangle here. D, total surplus increased by D. But if you look at producer surplus, it decreased by B, by this amount. But consumers also increased by B and D. So consumers enjoyed all this. Producers, however, domestic producers lost this, B, but in total, D was gained. So practice questions. What is the effect of exports? Using the 3-step recipe, determine the effect of exports on economic surplus, assuming the world price is higher than the domestic price. What will be the price of the traded good at the new price? What quantities will be demanded by domestic buyers? What quantity will be supplied by domestic sellers? What quantity will be traded? The consequences of exports, how exports shape the domestic market for snowmobiles. If there is no international trade, so this is the graph again with no international trade. This is the price of snowmobiles, and this is the quantity of snowmobiles produced in thousands, which I guess you don't have a number, but this is the equilibrium here. So let's say that the price of the exported good rises to to the world price. So this is the world price for snowmobiles, 12,000. So the price of the good is now going to increase to this amount. So buyers will never pay more than the world price, and sellers will never accept less than the world price. So at this new price, check the domestic demand curve to find the quantity demanded by domestic buyers fall, and the domestic supply curve to find the quantity supplied by domestic sellers rise. So if you look here, the quantity demanded by domestic buyers is going to fall to this amount, 40. We're just going to kind of follow the same kind of steps that we did before for imports. So the new price is going to be 12,000. This is going to be what domestic buyers buy, which is going to be less than before because it's more expensive. And this amount here is going to be the quantity supplied by domestic sellers, which is going to be more because the price is now higher. So you're going to see that there's going to be a new amounts different than the original equilibrium. And now if you look again, the difference between this new amount supplied versus this new amount demanded in the country, in the home country, is going to be different. There's going to be a difference of 30,000. So that's what the exports are going to be. It's going to be that difference between the amount supplied by domestic sellers and the amount demanded by domestic buyers. And if you look again, it's going to be the same kind of formula, but in different terms. If you looked originally, the domestic supply and demand graph, so this green area here, A and B, is going to be the consumer surplus, and C is going to be the producer surplus. This is without trade. And now if you allow trade at the new world price, you're going to see that there is going to be a consumer surplus of just A, and the producer surplus is going to increase to B, C, and D. And the total surplus is now going to be A, B, C, and D, this big kind of weird shape. And you can see it here. But now if you look at the difference, the consumer surplus is going to be just A for the domestic consumer surplus. And the producer surplus is going to be this bigger triangle now with B, C, and D. So you see now that consumers actually lost this triangle B that they originally had. So now we're seeing the flip side of it where consumers are losing more because of exports and the producers are gaining. So exports and economic surplus. We export those goods that foreign buyers are willing to pay more for, which raises the price of those goods. The higher price raises the quantity supplied by domestic sellers and reduces the quantity demanded by domestic buyers. Exports fill that gap, like we saw, between the quantity supplied and demanded, and producer surplus rises and consumer surplus declines. Sellers magnify their gains by selling more, while buyers mitigate their losses by buying less. But total economic surplus still rises. So here's just a table showing the different effects of international trade. It's basically just a summary of what we showed in the last few slides, but you guys can go over it if you want, just to get a very summarized look, but it's still worth understanding how all these changed. So who wins and loses? International trade increases economic surplus, but not everyone gains. Import competing businesses often oppose international trade, which makes sense. Why would you want the market to be flooded by a good that's being produced in another country at a cheaper price? You're going to lose out on a lot of business. And exporters and import dependent businesses often support international trade, where companies who depend on stuff produced in other countries would love international trade, where they want to get those foreign goods at cheaper prices. So who wins and who loses? Some practice questions. For each of the following, determine the effect on price, whether domestic buyers win or lose, and whether domestic sellers win or lose. So this is something you guys can do on your own and just think about. And if you have any questions, you can just come to my office hours or email me or message me on Slack, and I can tell you what I think of your answer, if it's accurate, if it makes sense or not. So I'll let you guys do that one. And another discussion question: illustrate and explain why free trade results in more total surplus when the world price exceeds the domestic price. And here's just a review. Reports basically the same as before. And yep, that's it for this section.